Recent polls show that the number of Americans attending religious services has now, for the first time, dropped below 50%. Are Americans becoming more rational, more scientific, more secular? Or are they simply substituting one set of dogmas for another, such as the dogma of identity politics? More and more commentators have noted that nominally secular Americans are exhibiting a strange sort of religiosity in their devotion to different political creeds. How are we to understand what's going on? Well, welcome to New Ideal Live, the podcast of the Ayn Rand Institute. My name is Ben Bayer. I'm a fellow at ARI. Today, we're going to be discussing this topic, what to expect from an America without God. Joining me today is ARI Senior Fellow Elan Journo. Hi, Elan.
Hey, Ben.
So, Elan, but to get us into this discussion, maybe it's a good idea to take a look at what some of these latest polls are actually telling us about the decline in traditional religiosity. What can you tell us?
Sure. So looking at this issue, there are a number of ways people are measuring this. So there's a Gallup poll from March of this year, and it found that I think it was 47% of Americans said they belonged to a church or a synagogue or a mosque. And that figure, 47%, is down from 50% 2 years ago, and get this, 70% from 1999. So that's not that far back, right? It's what, 20 plus 22 years or so. And the decline, now think of this as membership in a church or institution of worship or something like that. So now this is, it doesn't tell you that much. It's really a proxy, right? So it's interesting to kind of get into the phenomenon. One thing I would say is that as much as the church membership, if you could just think of it broadly like that, is going down, there's another figure that's been going up, and that is the what they call nones, people who don't associate with any sort of organized religion, N-O-N-E, not N-U-N. And that is which is an interesting thing, because does that actually mean that people are less religious, or just that they don't want to be part of an institution of worship? The other thing that's interesting here, it correlates with age. So one other dimension of this is that church membership was seen to be sort of really closely tied to that. So 66% of people who are characterized as traditionalists, US adults born before 1946, belong to a church. And that's in contrast to about 58% of baby boomers. And notice this decline, 50% of those in Generation X, is my generation, I guess. And then it keeps dipping to 36% for people thought of as millennials. So it's another kind of dimension of this graph. So as I said, I mean, it's an interesting development, and it's a question of what does it actually mean? And what do you think of this, Ben? What was your reaction when you saw these numbers?
Yeah, and I should mention that the point that you made about the rise of the nones, N-O-N-E-S, is important, because, you know, one way you could interpret this is, well, people still identify with a religion, they just don't go to church as much. But the fact that an increasing number of people, especially as they get younger, are not even identifying with a religion. I mean, the Gallup article suggests that is one of the big factors driving this. And, you know, just on the face of it, you know, coming from the perspective of someone who's, I mean, I am myself an atheist and believer in secular scientific philosophy, this would seem like a promising development. Religion encourages people to believe things as a matter of blind faith, dogmatically. And so you might look at this data and think, well, maybe people are starting to realize what's wrong with that approach, and they want to be less dogmatic themselves. They don't want to identify with these dogmas. And speaking from the perspective of morality, I mean, religion encourages moral dogmas, especially the dogma of self-sacrifice. And you could interpret this to mean, well, people are thinking more about what the kinds of things that religious morality has demanded them. It's demanded that they give up their happiness in their relationships and their sex lives, et cetera. And they're saying, no, we reject that. We want to live for the sake of our own happiness and not take someone's dogmatic demand that we give it up. That's one way that you could interpret this. But not necessarily the only way. There might be,
Yeah, I mean,
and some commentators have suggested other ways.
Yeah, I was going to say, Ben, it's easy to look at this data, and if you're on the side of science and a secular worldview, it's easy to say, "Oh, this is a great piece of news." But I think the real question here, and I think part of what I was fascinated by when I read into this topic, is what is actually the phenomenon? What is actually going on? And as you put it, people might still be religious but not go to church. So, is there really a bright spot here? What to make of it? And maybe we should try to unpack that a bit. Why don't we take that from there?
Yeah, and so especially since it's possible for somebody to be religious and still not go to church in a traditional sense, I mean, we should wonder, well, are there other ways in which they're going to church? In effect, it might not be involved sitting in pews or listening to preachers. And it might not even involve the trappings of traditional religion, but it might involve behavior that still has many of the marks of that same kind of mindset. And this is one of the things that a lot of commentators have noted. There was a controversy, in fact, just this past week, which was particularly notable because it involved one of the major secular humanist organizations and its dealings with one of the major secular humanist, atheist public intellectuals. And I'm speaking here of the American Humanist Association. And they revoked the Humanist of the the Humanist of the Year award that had been given to Richard Dawkins, a prominent atheist. The award was given to him back in 1996. The reason for the revocation is what's particularly noteworthy here. So it's not that Richard Dawkins was caught up in some sex scandal, which has happened to at least one other person who had their award revoked from the AHA. No, instead, it was a tweet that Richard Dawkins put up recently. And I think we can put that tweet up on screen. And it basically concerned Dawkins. Dawkins was pointing out what he took to be a kind of double standard between the people who are advocates, supporters of the rights of transgendered people, and those who support the idea that transgendered people should be able to identify as whichever sex they like, the double standard between that on the one hand, and the critics of what they call transracialism, the people who say you don't get to choose your race. And this is concerning, this is something that came up in the controversy, if you remember, a few years back, about Rachel Dolezal, who was identified originally as a white person, but then tried to identify as a black person. And Dawkins is basically pointing out a lot of the same people say that you should be able to identify as whatever sex you like, but not as whatever race you like. And he suggested and he argued that there is a kind of double standard here, that it's not clear why you get to do one and not the other. And the American Humanist Association, which presumably is sympathetic with the people who have this double standard, revoked his award on the grounds that this is just the latest case in which Dawkins exhibits a history of making statements that use the guise, and I'm quoting them here, a history of making statements that use the guise of scientific discourse to demean marginalized groups and approach antithetical to humanist values. Now, what's notable and what I think many commentators noticed about this latest decision is that the AHA, in their very brief statement revoking this award from Dawkins, they don't explain what's wrong with what he's doing. They merely reported that he did this. They reported that he that he made this tweet and that he questioned whether, and he in effect questioned whether or not people should be able to identify as whatever sex they like. And that was enough. So it looks to critics, and it looks to me as though Dawkins has committed a sin of questioning a dogma, even though the dogma seems to involve, at least ostensibly, some kind of double standard, some kind of contradiction. I mean, it's possible somebody could argue why there's no contradiction, but that's not what's being done here. So the AHA doesn't bother to explain why they think Dawkins is wrong to point this double standard out. They simply cite the fact that he's pointed it out, and that's enough to revoke his award and to dethrone him from the pantheon of secular humanist sainthood, in effect. And this isn't the only example. This is just the most recent, and it's one that's, I think, particularly striking because it's a nominally secular organization which, you know, has made its name in the past as a critic of religious dogmatism, and yet here it is doing something that looks a lot like a kind of excommunication ritual on behalf of one of its former saints. And I think there were some other examples that we wanted to talk about as well. You had a few, Elan.
Well, just to add to what you're saying about what happened to Richard Dawkins, what I understand about the American Humanist Association is that they regard themselves as being guided by reason explicitly, not as an accident or as an implicit point, as an explicit factor in their thinking and their decision-making, the values they want to put forward. And I think if I were in Dawkins' position, I would be galled at this, because here's a scientist, whatever you think of his statement on Twitter, even if you agree or disagree with it, he's being treated in a way that you would expect, that would be unsurprising if it came from a religious authority. It would be and it is shocking coming from an organization that puts itself out there as a voice championing the idea of reason, and that elevates people like him, who are scientists, and some of the other winners of this award are also scientists and intellectuals who explicitly engage and support sort of the Enlightenment kind of values. So, and I think there's really way to emphasize, so you characterize it as an excommunication practice. That's really what it looks like. And I think so this ties in with what we raised earlier. So this looks like a religious phenomenon, this case with Dawkins, and this is in the context of declining church membership. And yet, so here's a way in which there seems to be religion still going on, or religious behavior, and yet, and particularly with an organization that claims to be non-religious and it is a counterpoint to religion. So I think this is a really helpful illustration of the fact that church membership is a proxy for something. It doesn't really tell you what people are thinking. And here's a group of people who say they're not religious, and this is where they're going. I think it's useful to bring up here the observations. You mentioned a lot of intellectuals have observed this kind of thing. That there's one in particular that I've been following, John McWhorter, whose work I've read quite a bit of, and I admire some of it a lot. He is a linguist and a scholar. I think he's based at Columbia. One of the things he's been working on lately is a project that he's released in serial form on his website. It's basically a book that analyzes what's commonly called the woke phenomenon. And his thesis in this new book, I've read the first few chapters of it that he's released, and he's talked about this elsewhere too, is that this is essentially a new religion, or it is a religious movement, despite the trappings of being secular, liberal, and so forth. And in other words, it's coming from the so-called left side of the intellectual space, which is often associated with being secular, and yet it is, in his argument, a kind of religion. So just one thread out of this, and we can explore it further, is, so he indicates some ways in which this woke, and it's particularly the perspective on race, and so the whole debate around race, he draws out the idea that there is, for people who are non-people of color, let's put it that way, there is a kind of original sin with race. And it stands in a if you spell it out, it's absurd, but it's often not spelled out. It's just understood, and the behaviors that you see from the woke enforcers, in effect, or the inquisitors that are often going on, it's not spelled out, but this is actually what it would look like. And so it's really helpful to put it into words. So here's an example. And I think I forget where his source for this is, but it's really capturing something important. So if you say that you're not a racist on this view, it actually turns out you are. You must be. If you try to understand the experiences of minorities, that's an important thing for you to be doing, but you mustn't appropriate, and this is a term that's very loaded, right? I'm putting it in quotes. You mustn't appropriate the cultures of other people or the groups. So engage, but don't engage. You can deny being a racist. That's just proof that you are. Just to give one more example, if minorities leave a neighborhood, that is gentrification. That's a bad thing. And if the neighborhood improves and they can't, so there's all kinds of weird things about that. And this ties in with the idea of elevating race to a really prominent place in people's thinking. So the violation of any one of these positions, or you might call them dogmas or pieties, I'm not sure how you would map this on, but to violate them is to risk being excommunicated, in effect. You are no longer a reputable person. This is part of what we've talked about this previously, Ben, under the heading of, not a useful term, but it's the common one, it's cancel culture, right? I put that in air quotes. This is part of what is the engine, or the motive force behind it. You have said this, you must be racist, you cannot be a person that anyone engages with, you're gone. And this is constantly happening. So part of McWhorter's analysis, which I find really intriguing, is this mapping of the woke phenomenon in detail as this is a kind of religion, and we have to understand it this way. So I just to say it back to you. Yeah.
And we could go on here. Like there's I think more examples we could give from McWhorter about the woke phenomenon. But outside of that, even there's you and Keith Locke just had an episode of this podcast last week where we were discussing much the same issue, except with regard to environmental alarmism. We talked about how people like Steven Pinker and Michael Schellenberger have written books noting that there's a kind of parallel form of religious fervor connected with environmentalism. So this movement is always predicting one or another apocalypse. When that apocalypse doesn't happen, they don't apologize for making a mistake. They continue to predict new ones, and in defiance of the evidence of their past errors. And I mean, you even have kind of rituals performed without any evidence that they do anything, recycling being the most obvious one here. So these are just a few data points. We've got views about race in politics. We've got environmentalism. We've got the views about sex that came up in the recent controversy with Richard Dawkins. Something similar, I think, happened when J.K. Rowling tried to raise critical questions about the ideology around transgenderism. But again, the point here is not even to say that these critics of transgenderism or critics of environmentalism or what have you are right about everything that they say. It's more about, well, how are they treated? What happens when they give arguments for their view? Are they simply dismissed and excommunicated as some kind of sinners without explanation, simply on the grounds of the content of their views, or not? And I think there is definitely a kind of religious fervor in a lot of these viewpoints, and that gets us to somebody who observed this same kind of phenomenon, but has a very interesting spin on it that we want to talk about. This is the article by Shadi Hamid, right, Elan?
Yeah, this is an article that caught my eye when it came out. So this is in The Atlantic. It's dated in the April print issue. It was online for a while. Now, he is a scholar of the Middle East and particularly of Islam, and he also studies religion and politics outside of that region. So he has a broad range of interests. The article is really worth reading. I don't agree with a lot of it, as we'll discuss. I think he's grappling with a phenomenon. He's trying to identify something. I think he's got some things right about what's going on, but I don't think the explanation is really sufficient or helpful in thinking about it. So one of the things he points to is that if people who are on this sort of secular orientation were thinking that the decline in church membership, the data points that we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, if they see that as a hopeful sign that people, and particularly politics, are going to be more rational, then they're mistaken, because look at the sorts of things we're living through. So we've just been talking about some examples with Dawkins and others, and this whole woke atmosphere that is driving some of this. And his point is really that when organized religion fades, in taking church membership as the evidence for that, when that fades, it doesn't really go away. It gets sublimated, or it gets manifested in another way. So he argues that, let me just quote a bit from what he says here, is American faith, it turns out, is as fervent as ever. It's just that what was once religious belief has now been channeled into political belief. Political debates over what America is supposed to mean have taken on the character of theological disputations. And this, let me continue the quote, "This is what religion without religion looks like," end quote. So he's making the case in this article that the political dynamics that we're seeing and that we've been just sketching out a bit are, in effect, the impulse for religion, or the desire for religion, or the need for it, channeled into politics, and that he thinks is a very bad thing. And there's reasons to think that it is a bad thing, but not necessarily for the reasons he talks about. So he gives examples, some of the kind of things we've been talking about. So he talks about, on the left, there's this woke phenomenon, as he characterizes it, where he identifies there's the religious notions of original sin, there's atonement, there's ritual, there's excommunication, but all of these are repurposed or moved into a seemingly secular framework, and they're rolled out and used in that way. And then at the same time, and this is an interesting observation in the piece, he thinks that there's a counterpart to that on the intellectual scene coming from what you might call the political right. And he talks about the sort of Trump-centric ethno-nationalism that has kind of taken center stage. And he thinks of them as draping themselves in the trappings of organized religion a little, but so they're not really detached from religion, but that the result is that it looks like a revival of sort of the same fervor, but without necessarily all the trappings of religion. So he thinks of there being, on both ends of the intellectual landscape, if you want to think of it that way, two kinds of secular religious phenomena. Secular in the sense that they look secular, but in effect, if you think of them, essentially that's how they're behaving. They're behaving like religion.
Yeah, I should just mention that, especially about the Trump movement. I mean, there's two dimensions of this. I mean, one is that Trump himself has tried to court evangelicals and their actual traditional religion. But even if you leave that aside, I think part of what Hamid is pointing out is that there's a kind of secularized religion still evident in treating Trump as the savior, and he's kind of the preacher at these sort of revival tent style meetings. You especially see this in the kind of QAnon phenomenon, where he's thought to be kind of a literal savior against Satanists who are eating babies or whatever. So yeah, I agree that Hamid's article raises some very interesting questions about what's going on, and he's got his finger on the pulse of something new that is happening in American society. We should ask some questions ourselves, though, about the way that he and others like him are trying to analyze this phenomenon. And certainly he's getting some things right here, that there are some real similarities between traditional religion and these new kind of political dogmas. I mean, they both definitely involve, they're both faith-based in the way where there's certain doctrine that you kind of have to adhere to, otherwise you're kicked out. And even if you've got good critical questions about it, both of them encourage this kind of a tribalistic rallying around a certain figure, whether it's around Trump himself or around the various figures on the woke left. Lately, it's been around martyrs, I think. But so I think it's accurate to say that they have a kind of religious aspect, a religious overtone, dimension to what they're doing. There's a kind of religious fervor. Whether that makes them religion per se is something I think we should still talk about. But I know you wanted to challenge something a little bit about the way he's conceptualizing this phenomenon, even if there's a real phenomenon there.
Yeah, I encourage people to take a look at the articles. It's not that long, it's worth reading. One of the things that comes out of it is, I think, suspicious or definitely needs to be questioned. And that is a premise of his analysis is that, in effect, any deeply felt conviction that you might have is just a form of religion. It's just he quotes somebody saying it's a sublimated form of religion. I'm not quite sure what sublimated form of religion really means, but his view is that if it's meaningful and deeply held and a conviction, then it's religion. So what's striking about that is that leaves no room for anything that is a rational set of ideas, which I think it's a not a surprising view that he holds, but it's disappointing because there's thousands of years worth of philosophy that has been offered throughout mankind's history that is tempted to deal with the questions of life, the big questions, and offer answers that are not based in religion. I think philosophy is the step forward from religion in the sense that it's using reason to try to understand and answer these questions. So there's a kind of gap in the analysis where it's as if philosophy doesn't exist. It's never had any meaning in human history. And this ties in with his analysis of what is distinctive about America. And he really puzzles over this because he says that America has a creed. And in a sense, it's true. America's founding was distinctively based on a philosophic orientation, that you can trace the philosophical influences that led the founding fathers to craft the founding documents the way they did. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and many of the features of those documents are shaped by deep thinking about political philosophy. But for Hamid in this analysis, it's, well, America is basically religious. It always has been, and the role that Enlightenment philosophy had in America's creed, it's just not meaningful to him. It doesn't even register in this article. It would be interesting to ask him sort of what his actual view is if it's not represented in this article well. So part of what happens is that you get his view that it's a really sad thing that religion is on the decline, because on the one hand we get sort of the woke mob, we get the sort of the worst elements of people following Trump, and he laments both of these, and he doesn't think we should be cheering for that. And the implication is, well, if only we went back to a time when religiosity was higher, church membership was higher, people were going to mosque, and that doesn't really make any sense to me, because if you think more broadly throughout human history, the more religion has had a role in politics and in human life, the more conflict there's been, the more friction and the more wars and more bloodshed there's been. That is the story of human civilization. So there's a real question here is, he's taking for granted if you have a deep view, it's religion. There's no sense that there's a rational alternative in his view. And the implication is that we need to go back to some point at which there's more religion in human life. And it's not a helpful analysis, because I don't think it's not true, and it would lead to other and different kinds of problems for us. So in terms of understanding this phenomenon, I don't think it's really pointing in the right direction.
Yeah, I mentioned before that I think that there is a real point to the comparison that he's making to saying that there is this religious dimension of these political dogmas. But in acknowledging that, I think it's still important to ask the question, okay, are they literally religions? And when people say that they are literally religions, I'm a little skeptical, and I want to be critical of that, because I know that, and I don't know if this is true of Hamid himself, but there are, I think, religious conservatives who will often point to political phenomena they see on the left, whether it's multiculturalism or environmentalism, and they'll say these are new religions. And part of what they're doing there, and what I think they're trying to do, is they're trying to accuse these leftists of simply being hypocrites, because the left is supposed to be secular. And so when they themselves adopt a religious mindset, that's just a way to score a rhetorical point against them by calling them hypocrites. And it's also a way, I think, that religious conservatives have of calling out the fact that there are potential rival religions to their religious followers to warn them against the heresy or the apostasy of adopting one of these rival religions. And so we should be careful when we look at these kinds of accusations, because they may be motivated from that perspective. I'm not saying that I think that's what Hamid's doing. I'm not really sure how he identifies religiously or politically, for that matter. But it's something to be on guard against. Now, when we look to somebody like John McWhorter, who himself, I think, considers himself to be some kind of liberal Democrat. I don't know where he stands religiously either, but it's less likely that he's making this kind of move. And in particular, I don't think he says that all ideologies are religions in the way that Hamid seems to be arguing. Because I agree with you, Elan, that's a major distortion, that it leaves out the entire realm of rational philosophy and runs it together with religion. And to the extent that he can't see the difference, he's, I think, buying into the same problem that he's criticizing, the idea that there couldn't be arguments given for these kinds of positions. But in any case, even John McWhorter makes this same kind of point. And in his book, he says, no, I'm not saying it's like a religion. I'm saying these new political doctrines, they actually are religions. And he makes an argument in his book about how if an anthropologist from an alien planet were to come on the scene for the first time and compare these political movements to religions, that they wouldn't see any difference between the two of them. And again, I do think that there are real similarities for the reasons that we've cited. We cited a number of the really important and intriguing similarities. At the same time, I think it does make a difference that one of the things that is essential to religion is that it involves a kind of supernatural worldview. And that's not something that's true about these secular movements, whether it's wokeism or environmentalism. It doesn't say that there's literally another dimension where there's a supernatural being who's looking over us. Now, it might be that there are like proxies for that in these worldviews, like there might be a Gaia figure in certain kinds of environmental ideologies, though certainly not all of them. And that's important, but it makes a difference that religion has this supernatural worldview attached to it. It makes a difference for the fact that it's, I think, easier for it to insulate itself from empirical refutation. That makes a difference for its staying power as a cultural force. One of the things that I think Leonard Peikoff he makes a very provocative point in his dim hypothesis book to say that part of the reason why the religious ideologies were able to maintain political power for a millennia in Europe was precisely this fact that they were able to make completely arbitrary claims about an afterlife which could never be disproved, and therefore able to keep the faithful stringing them along over the centuries. Whereas, communism, for instance, was only able to hold on to political power for 70 years. It was making predictions about what would actually happen on Earth. So that makes a difference, whether it's got this supernatural worldview or not. That said, these similarities are still very real. And Ayn Rand herself had perhaps a broader concept that one could use to capture these similarities, and it was the concept of mysticism. She said there were mystics of spirit, which she identified with the traditional religious supernatural worldview. But then, and this is something that I think threw a lot of her critics for a loop, they didn't get why she was saying this. But she said, no, the communists, the leftists, the secular types, I assume she would group the contemporary versions of leftism under this as well, were what she called mystics of muscle. And so even though they didn't believe in a supernatural dimension, they still believed that there was a kind of ineffable form of knowledge that the elect could have that would give them insight into real morality. And so you have in communism the dialectic process, for instance, and presumably now we have equivalents of that with wokeism, with the various racial and environmental ideologies that tell where their advocates have whatever intuition it is that informs them of the truth of their basic principles, even though there's not scientific demonstration of it. So there's still, like, even when these critics, I think, are overstating their case in saying these are literally forms of religion, I do think they're still capturing something very important. There's certainly religious elements and aspects to these ideologies and these movements. And you might even argue that they're forms of mysticism, even if they're not a religious supernatural worldview.
Ben, I'm curious just to get your reaction to this thought. What do you think it's helpful to separate out some of the trappings that religions we recognize with religion? So if you go to Catholic Church, there's all sorts of pageantry about the Mass, and there's I think of it as costumes and just the books and the rituals, and that we think of that as part of a religion. Or if you go to a mosque, there's the process of, wash your hands and feet, and you go and you're positioned on the mat, and so those kinds of things. From is the basic question of, why do you believe in this? What is the basis for the claims that there's a supernatural being, that he tells you to do this action, that this is a virtue and this is a vice, and that this is, I'm just trying to connect it to what you're describing in Rand's conception of the mysticism, because that seems like a much broader way of thinking than just, this religion has excommunication, this behavior has excommunication. So that seems like it's relevant and important, but it's not as fundamental as, what's your evidence for this?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that the ritualistic expressions that you see in both religion and in these secular movements, part of the reason why these are evidence of a similarity is that you would expect both of them to be effects of the deeper cause of this dogmatic approach to knowledge that Ayn Rand called mysticism. So, like, why do you need rituals? Why do you need loyalty to cult-like leaders? Well, it's a way of demonstrating your faith. It's a way of saying, I've been told to believe something, and to show that I believe it, I'm going to go through these motions, even if the motions don't have any obvious, function or any rational basis. You're a Catholic, you're supposed to believe that the host that you take during communion is literally the body of Christ, because a priest pronounces a blessing over it, even though it's made of bread. And there's whole Catholic theologic doctrines that are erected to explain the possibility of transubstantiation, of how something that's made of bread can be turned into human flesh, even though it has all the sensible qualities of bread. So it's an act of faith to engage in these rituals. And so you're demonstrating your faith by doing them, and you're showing that you're one of the in crowd. And I think that's actually going to help us transition to the last big topic that we wanted to talk about, which is more about Ayn Rand's analysis of this kind of dogmatic tribalistic behavior wherever you see it in our culture.
Yeah, I think that's a useful issue to raise, because Ayn Rand's analysis of tribalism is deep and it's distinctive. I think it really stands out. And the reason I think it's helpful in thinking about the phenomenon we're talking about, and the phenomenon is people who are behaving in religious ways, not necessarily following religion, and not sort of associating with necessarily an institutionalized religion, but just behaving in ways that are dogmatic and non-rational, and I think in both cases group oriented. And that's a feature that Hamid and McWhorter, I haven't read all of McWhorter's serial yet, but I don't think they really see that as significant. I think it is, because it has to do with a big part of what is motivating people. And that's why I think it's useful to think about tribalism in our society as a way of trying to process what is going on with this mob behavior on both different sides of the political spectrum, or the political landscape, I should say. And Rand's analysis of tribalism, we're just going to give a sketch here. There's a lot to say about it. I've written about it, and obviously you should read her perspective first and chew on it. But the basic observation is that, contrary to what people think, tribalism, the desire to be part of a group and to lose oneself in a group, is not built in. It's not innate. You're not programmed to be a tribal member, as some even scientists today think is the case. it's actually rooted in a fact of human nature, which is you have a choice, and either you activate your mind and guide your life according to your judgment, or you default to a passive state. You don't really take those steps. And if you're in that passive state, if you make that default, then there's sort of a sequence of steps that will lead you to still need direction, even if you're not the one originating the direction. And you need sort of philosophic framework. That's the positive, to put it that way. And when you lack that, you look for it somewhere. And where a lot of people go is to a group, a tribal group, because it gives you sort of a ready-made solution to this problem, which is, what am I going to do with myself? What is right? What is wrong? How do I navigate this world? And the group gives you an identity. It gives you a pseudo sense of self-worth, because now I'm part of this group, and it has all these things that are sources of prestige or value, or kind of helps to clarify who you are. And you have answers because you get them from the authority, from the group itself, from the spokesman of the group. So that's sort of the widest way of conceptualizing of what happens here in her view of this. And I think that's really an important feature of what's going on in the political landscape. When we look at the religious-like sort of dogmatic behavior with the woke phenomenon, and we look at it on the other side with the sort of nationalist, Trump-centered perspective that you see many people flocking to him, and the conspiracism example that you gave, I think some of it is people finding a group that they can identify with. That's not necessarily an innate group, like this is to do with your skin color, but it's something that they can gravitate to. And this is the key point. This is how it ties in with that observation you raised regarding mysticism. The way the conclusions or the guidance of the group operates in your mind, it's not, oh yeah, I'm convinced this is the right thing to do. I'm convinced this is the truth. It's, I've been told and I'm going to believe. And once it's held that way, it really just functions like a religious dogma. I mean, maybe religious dogma is redundant, but it really functions as its non-rational conclusions. And then just a further point before I hand this back to you, Ben, part of what's fascinating about the way these sorts of ideas work on people. So if people accept a dogma, for example, all white people are racist. That's one of the dogmas we hear from the woke people. I think it's false. It's clearly false. It's just not even remotely true. But if you accept that just on someone's say-so, on the authority of a group that you think, oh, I'm just going to take what they tell me because you're subservient to them, you've assimilated to this tribe, you haven't accepted it because of evidence. And if someone challenges you, you don't have evidence to justify it. All you have is, well, I accepted it on authority. Why don't you? You should do the same thing. There's no argument that you can give because you didn't accept it on any argument. Now there could be an argument for it, but that's not really how it stands in your mind. And that's really helpful for thinking about the dynamic of the way some of the members of these groups behave. So, there's a video that went viral. I believe it was from a school board meeting somewhere, maybe in New York City or one of the boroughs. I forget which one it was, where a parent was challenged on a claim that was, it sort of comes out of the woke catechism. It comes out of the woke dogmas. And someone challenged her with, well, help me understand why this is the case. And her response was, you have to read this book. If you haven't read this book by, I think it was the Kindi book, I forget, Ibram Kindi, or maybe it was the D'Angelo book. These best-selling books that are really pushing this particular view of race that are central to this moment. And her attitude was, well, if you haven't read the good book, I can't speak to you. It's for you to read. And it's not that I can recreate the arguments I was convinced by, and then you can be convinced by those arguments. Just, this is the authority. You have to swallow it. And it's wrong for you to challenge me. And so you can see how that really, and it goes to their emotional, like the whole thing is like she's erupting, and the emotional temperature of this video is just, it's crazy. And I think it comes from feeling, well, I don't know, I don't have any basis for this. It's a dogma in my mind. I mean, if you were putting it into words in their sort of in their mind, and you can see how that would manifest in both anger and resentment over and above what you might say is justified by some claim of injustice or some claim of wrongdoing, I think you can put those aside. It's more, I think, often driven by this feeling of being cornered. I don't know how to answer this. There is no rational answer. I'm just going to emote and spew anger. So I think, just to summarize the point, that there's a lot to be gained from thinking about Ayn Rand's analysis of tribalism and how it's essentially a cognitive issue. It's a cognitive default, how that leads people into these kinds of groups, how they then are guided by authority, and they're obedient to authority, and that sort of what they believe is a set of dogmas, what the tribe tells them. And then this kind of helps to understand a little some of the ways in which people behave when they're put on the spot. Of go, why do you believe this? And there is no rational answer because they never accepted it for rational reasons.
There's a lot to pick up on there. One thing I would note is that to reflect back on the criticism that I think you rightly made of Hamid, that he ran together all religion, all ideology, all conviction with religion, is particularly unfortunate, especially since what it has the effect of ignoring is the existence of rational philosophy. And it's precisely the ignoring of philosophy that is part of the problem that leads to tribalism in Rand's view. Her view is that, as you mentioned before, people have a choice about whether to be active thinkers or to be passive thinkers. They have a choice about whether they're going to ask questions about why they believe what they believe. They have a choice to try to get a broader understanding of the things around them and of the big question, the answers to the big questions in life, or they can just kind of passively absorb the viewpoints of others around them. And that's her reason for thinking that we all need philosophy. Is in effect, we end up adopting philosophic views whether we know it or not. And so our only choice is whether they're going to be rational or not. People who default on that choice, who end up just absorbing the views of the people around them, are the ones who have what she calls an anti-conceptual mentality. They're the ones who then go in for tribalism because, not being able to answer the big questions themselves, they default to the answers that are given to them by other people. And Elan, you were talking about the phenomenon of the type of person who, when challenged, sort of backs into a corner, gets defensive, yells a lot, invokes sacred texts. And this is something that Rand specifically analyzes in her discussion of tribalism. She talks about how it's a sign of the fact that they seek safety and comfort in their membership in a group. And when someone doesn't follow the rules of the group, all they can do is lash out at the other for fear that this is somebody who challenges, in effect, their default. And one of the reasons that we need philosophy in particular, and one of the reasons Rand thinks we need philosophy in particular, is that we need answers to the big questions about morality in life. And we'll either answer those for ourselves, we'll either be able to come up with principles that we can demonstrate and connect to reality ourselves, or again, we'll end up absorbing them uncritically from the people around us. And on that point, there's a quotation I definitely want to put on screen where Rand understands what tribalism and what the tribalistic mentality means for morality. She says, it's obvious why the morality of altruism, and I'll say a word about what that is in a minute, is a tribal phenomenon. She does too. Prehistorical men were physically unable to survive without clinging to a tribe for leadership and protection against other tribes. The cause of altruism's perpetuation into civilized areas is not physical, but psycho-epistemological. That's speaking to this psychological issue we've been talking about before. You're automatically going to absorb these answers if you're not trying to answer them for yourself. The men of self-arrested perceptual mentality are unable to survive without tribal leadership and protection against reality. The doctrine of self-sacrifice, that's what altruism is, does not offend them. They have no sense of self or of personal value. They do not know what it is they are asked to sacrifice. They have no firsthand inkling of such things as intellectual integrity, love of truth, personally chosen values, or a passionate dedication to an idea. And one of the things I think is interesting about this passage is, well, first it shows if you default on thinking philosophically yourself, if you don't think that rational philosophy is even an option to consider, then as with all other issues, you're going to absorb your moral ideas from other people. But especially because of the fact that you are afraid of thinking for yourself and want to be told by others what to think, the ideas about morality that you accept are going to be particularly conducive to that need. They're going to be ideas that say thinking for yourself isn't that important. Standing up for yourself isn't that important. You should just go along with the crowd. You should give up your own concerns, your own critical questions, your own interests if the crowd demands that you do it. And of course, I hope it's clear by now to people listening that that's exactly the kind of demand that is being issued by these various political dogmas that we've been talking about. That's the demand that's being issued, against Richard Dawkins when he raises a critical question about transgender ideology. And it's not that there's even a counter argument that's given to him. It's just that he's committed a sin, and the cardinal sin has been thinking for himself, asking a critical question, making an argument for himself that goes against what other people believe. And he's supposed to sacrifice his own thinking out of deference to the comfort and the feelings and the consensus view of other people. And so at the root of this kind of religious mentality that we've been talking about is this kind of tribalistic view of morality, where what's moral is giving up what you believe and what you value for what other people demand. And it's, of course, the view that you would expect when people are afraid to think for themselves in the first place. That's the view of morality they're going to accept as well. I don't know if we wanted to say any more about Rand's views on that issue, Elan, or maybe we should go to questions at this point.
Yeah, we can bring in more during the questions. Let's see what people are asking. Thanks all for being here. Thank you for those of you who are on the super chat, and we appreciate your donations and support for the channel. It's great to see. So I'm going to look at some of the questions. Do you have them handy, Ben?
Yeah. One simpler question that came up from YouTube was, who are the priests of this new church? And I think in part we've started to answer that question. There are texts that are invoked on the left as sort of sacred texts. So we mentioned Ibram Kendi and D'Angelo. I can't remember her first name. Are they priests in the exact same sense that Catholic priests are priests? Well, perhaps not exactly. And there are differences in these movements, but it certainly does seem like, for some people at least who invoke these texts, that they're treated as kind of authority figures. And I think in some cases, these figures are actually making arguments for their perspectives. You can raise questions about whether the arguments are any good. I don't even know if they're being asked if they're asking to be treated as authorities, but certainly there are people who are treating them as authorities, whether that's what they want or not. And the same is probably true when you look at the environmental movement. That I'm not sure. So the clear example here would be, or the closest example of somebody who'd come to being a kind of authority figure would be Greta Thunberg, who's I think venerated by some people as a saint, as a kind of oracle, who is especially evident because she's a child and she hasn't studied the scientific questions in a great level of detail. She's got no academic credentials, but she's held up as a kind of saintly figure for the sake of reverence. It's one thing if you're listening to what an environmental scientist has to say about climate change, but if like the center of your veneration is Greta Thunberg, that starts to look a lot more like a kind of priestly figure. And if you had examples of your own.
I was going to make a comment about the question and the way we often think. So it's an interesting thing that we take religion as a kind of familiar phenomenon, and then we look for, well, what's the analog to this? Who is the priest of this new church? And you made some interesting points earlier in the conversation about how, pushing back against the McWhorter's analysis, which is to treat it as a full-on religion. It's useful to ask, what are these, if you take the best, sort of most sophisticated intellectual form of sort of the woke phenomenon, I think that's probably what you get in those books. Well, maybe that's too charitable, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, that's what it is. How should one think about these? And I think religion is a concrete under a wider issue, which is it's a primitive, I think, groping attempt to try to answer some fundamental questions about life. And the actual field that should deal with this is philosophy. But one of the things, and this, I want to bring in the point from Ayn Rand on this, which is to think about philosophic ideas or ideologies, just sets of ideas that are trying to grab at some questions. Maybe they're not full philosophies, maybe they're more like religions, maybe they're more primitive than that. But to think of them as they're not at all neutral to human life. They all have like a moral valence. They have some value. They're either positive or negative. They're either good for human life or they're not good for human life. And I just want to provoke people and suggest that they go and explore Rand's analysis further, because one of the things she says is that when you're looking at these sorts of things, like a new ideology that comes on the scene or a new sort of, intellectual phenomenon like this, is to treat it as a philosophic detective. She has a fascinating article. We'll put a link to this at the end of the discussion. And one of the points that comes out here, and we were talking about this the other day, Ben, and it's that she has a devastating analysis of what she regards as irrational philosophies or irrational ideology. And that is that I think it's that they have a certain goal in mind, and the goal is really bad. It's to exert control over human people. And in the philosophy that itself is a means of rationalization for something. So there's an ulterior dimension to it. There's an ulterior goal. And that goes to some of what you were raising. I think some tantalizing points you raised about the psychological dimension of this, which sort of really intersects with the philosophy, which is there's a psychological motive and connect. So the main thing I wanted to raise here is that when we think about these, yes, it's helpful to think of them as analogs to religion, but let's step back and say, what is a religion? What are these irrational, non-rational ideologies? How should we think of them? And part of what I find fascinating in Rand's analysis is she has a deep account of what an irrational philosophy is for. It's not just an accidentally wrong thing. It's often the case that someone created this, and the outcome has a certain purpose, and it's a devastating account.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I thought that was an interesting point to think about was that you can see, I think there's further evidence for the fact that irrational philosophies are systems of rationalization for baser psychological motives. You can see more evidence for that in the fact that, well, when a religion starts to lose cultural, political power, those same psychological insecurities or whatever, they're not going anywhere necessarily. And so some other ideology, some other movement pops up to serve the same kinds of purposes. And I think that's part of what you're seeing in the transition from traditional religion to these political doctrines. That actually connects somewhat to another question that came up in YouTube. Can you please comment on whether there are metaphysical similarities between traditional religion and political or social religion, or is it only similarities in the political and social levels? And I think there are. I mentioned that I think there is an important difference between traditional religion and these political doctrines insofar as the first involves belief in a supernatural dimension and the second doesn't. But that doesn't mean that there aren't any further similarities as to their view of the universe. And here's one in particular that is relevant to the way in which these different ideologies will still serve as rationalizations for psychological motives that are suspect. Determinism. Most of these viewpoints are deterministic. Most of them deny the existence of free will. Religion does this prominently, in spite of what some religious people say. If you think there's a omniscient supernatural being who has control over the universe and has foreknowledge of everything that's going to happen, it's virtually impossible. I think it is impossible to reconcile that with real human free will. And of course, original sin is an expression of this idea, the idea that we're all born sinners. Likewise, on the left, Marxism is famously deterministic. It says that we're all products of our economic and class interests. And of course, you see now versions of that in the various kinds of racial ideologies where we're all products of our ethnicity, we're products of the structures of oppression that have treated members of one ethnicity or another in different ways. These are all forms of determinism. They all deny the existence of free will. Interestingly, Ayn Rand thought that the big problem with racism was that it denied free will and said that we're all products of our race or our biology or whichever equivalent you want to talk about. And part of the reason that philosophy, in her view, invokes determinism is to rationalize away those who don't want to take responsibility for their own choices. It's a way of abdicating your own moral responsibility. It's very clear in the case of religion. If you get to, every time you sin, you get to say, we're all sinners. I can't help it. Nobody's perfect. That's part of what's going on there. I think you see versions of that in the left-wing political doctrines too.
And before I know we should be wrapping up soon, but let's take one more minute maybe. Do you want to offer a quick thought to this question from the super chat relating the discussion today to Ayn Rand's essay, Requiem for Man? Maybe you could just give us 30 seconds on what Requiem for Man is about, and then if you have any comments on the relationship.
So this was an essay she wrote in the 1960s, critiquing one of the papal encyclicals, Populorum Progressio. I can't remember which pope wrote it, but this is the one that called for universal global statism, welfare statism, massive redistribution of wealth from the rich nations to the poor nations. And so I don't remember the essay well enough right now to say more about the specific parallels. I mean, obviously she would say that this is a clear expression of a religious mentality coming from the religious morality of altruism, of self-sacrifice. But she also has a lot to say in that essay about the psychological motives of the church and what it reveals about them and about their hatred for people of ability and their hatred of rationality, that it would demand this kind of sacrifice, which I think that's then a further instance of this point that irrational philosophies are systems of rationalization. You often see that kind of analysis coming from her when she's talking about religion. You see it in Requiem for Man. You also see it in her essay of Living Death, where she analyzes the church's views about contraception and abortion, which she thinks are also rationalizations for deep hatred for human self-esteem. And there's a lot to explore there, but it'll have to suffice for now, I think.
Well, thank you all for your questions. We'll collect all these. We're having a Q&A next week, and we'll try to incorporate whatever questions we weren't able to get to that are of general interest. So maybe we should wrap up here, Ben.
Yeah, let's share some resources that we have. Some of the things we mentioned in passing, a couple of essays by Ayn Rand, both from the book Philosophy Who Needs It. And we talked today about how she thought the need for philosophy was so central. It was a need that tribalist mentalities are defaulting on. One of those essays was The Missing Link, where she, I think, lays out her most systematic analysis of the tribalist mentality. Also Philosophic Detection, which we mentioned earlier, where she talks about how irrational philosophies are systems of rationalization. That's all in Philosophy Who Needs It. There's also a really great essay that Elan wrote a couple of years ago, I think, called The Virulent Pull of Tribalism. And this was, if I remember correctly, Elan analyzing some recent analyses of tribalism, along the lines of the people who say that it's just an innate instinct we're all born with, and you explain the difference between that view and Rand's view that tribalism is a default, where that takes over when we don't choose to think actively and philosophically for ourselves. So those are some resources to check out more about the topic of tribalism. Also, a few announcements about upcoming episodes. Next week, we are going to be having on this very episode we're going to be answering your general philosophic questions. We've already received some of these from you. If you have more questions that you'd like to suggest, questions about objectivist philosophy as such, please send us an email. I'll give you an email address later when we're wrapping up, but we're still collecting questions, and it's not too late to send us your questions if you've got them. That's Wednesday, May 5th, same time as usual. Same time slot as usual with New Ideal Live. Also, please join us today. Immediately after this episode, Elan and I are going to be moving over to Clubhouse to talk more about some of the issues that we've discussed today. So if you've got an iPhone, if you've got an iOS device, look up the Ayn Rand Club on Clubhouse, and Elan and I will be having an after-party discussion of some of the things that came up today. Otherwise, if you like this broadcast, if you'd like to be able to follow us in the future, if you're watching on YouTube, several things you can do. You can subscribe to this channel. You can click the bell button to get notifications for when we go live or post new material in the future. Also consider liking this episode, writing a comment if you're watching the recording in the comment section. All of those things help optimize the algorithm so that more people can follow and more people find out about this channel. Likewise, if you're watching on Facebook, consider liking this the post or writing a comment. That will also help optimize the algorithm. And last but not least, if you have questions about material that came up today, or if you have questions you'd like to submit to that Q&A episode that we're doing next week, send us an email at newideal@aynrand.org. We read all the emails that come in. We try to answer many of them. I suspect that even the questions that we don't answer for next week's episode that are sent in, I will try to at least send a brief answer to eventually anyway, though they're building up right now, so it's going to take me some time to do that. But that's all I've got for today. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Thanks, Elan, for this very interesting discussion. This will conclude our episode, but we will see you all momentarily on Clubhouse for more discussion. Thanks.